All right, so before we start, I just want to
Yeah.
introduce, I found Helen-Chantal Pike has written a couple of books, 3 books about postcards. And one of them I have and found, it's about postcards in New Jersey. It's a great book. It really is. It's got a lot of postcards in it and sort of organized by different areas in New Jersey. So I found the book, and that's how I found Helen.
Okay, so here we are. Oh, I did this talk back in 2017 in St. Johnsbury, Vermont, at the Athenaeum. It was based on my postcard collections of Vermont and New Hampshire. I've had a huge postcard collection, and when I moved up here, I downshifted everything to where I'm living because I hope to write another book about my father's life. I think it's going to be a memoir, and it's going to sort of span a whole lot of things. But I made a huge donation to the New Jersey Special Collections at Rutgers University, of my entire postcard collection. So I had 12 binders on Asbury Park, and we're going to talk about that pretty quickly. We advance to the next slide, though. This will show you the interior of that humble little book. So my father's best friend from college was a freelance lecturer, and he'd go all around the country, and in every airport he would find a chrome postcard of a state capitol building, and then he'd send it to me. And this is how I learned geography, and this is how I learned what the state capitals were. And I still have this postcard collection. I did not donate this to Rutgers. I just held on to it, and I'm rather attached to it and all of his simple sentiments on the back. But at one time, Illinois, I think, had 4 different capitals, and this was Vandalia was the second capital location. Then it had 3 locations, I think, in Springfield, possibly 4. And so he didn't get me all 4 of them, but he got me these 2, and then Indiana. And this was just sort of the back, and all the stamps are pretty intact, and so there's probably some value for anybody that's a stamp collector, for these. But that's just the interior of that humble little album that I showed you earlier. When I was a kid and we'd come up here in the 60s, and by up here I mean to Vermont and New Hampshire, we had one of those square Eastman Kodak cameras that we would take family pictures from, but they were never as good as these chrome postcards were. And I was always given a quarter for spending money on these summer vacations. And so I would spend it on buying postcard views, because I, even then at 7 and 8 years old, realized that the whoever was taking these pictures had something far more sophisticated than what my parents were using for our family pictures. So I started just collecting these various views from up and down the Connecticut River Valley. I don't have, I have very few of those left now. They didn't quite last, but the idea of collecting postcards to show things that you can't see or you wouldn't photograph naturally, has been with me since I was in the single digits. So we go to the next slide. You'll see I think this should be the cover of, are you familiar with Arcadia Publishing? Some people call these the little brown books because they have these sepia covers on them. And this was my third one that I had done. I had done 2 others prior to this. And in that, I had sort of tracked people whose families of origin had actually started in Asbury Park before they migrated to other communities on the Jersey Shore. And so by this point, I was a travel writer for the Boston Herald. Whenever they weren't sending me to some outpost in America or sending me to a foreign country, I was always pitching them stories about someplace in New Jersey, and I would buy postcards of what these destinations used to look like. And eventually I acquired quite a few on Asbury Park. And so for my third book, I pitched Arcadia a volume on the founding of Asbury Park. And if you flip to the next slide, um, what I wanted to do was create I wanted to use all the images that I could find, and basically along the boardwalk, what I did was I created these 2-page spreads with 4 images. That's kind of the formula that Arcadia prefers to use. They prefer to use these horizontal shots. So the idea would be you could be on the boardwalk and it's parallel Ocean Avenue, and you could be looking into the interior of Asbury Park, and this would be the southeast corner, and this would be the the southwest corner, and this would be the northwest corner. And then if you turned around and you looked at the boardwalk at the time, this would be what you would find, a postcard view of the boardwalk on the opposing, northeast and northwest corners. And so I created an entire chapter based on putting postcards together for all 4 corners of this. And in the end, I had 12 binders, 12 regular 3-ring binders of postcards that I eventually gave to the New Jersey Special Collections. So this is the only postcard view here is that's not a postcard view is the one on the bottom of page 104. But you can tell from the postmark stamped on page 105 that that's indeed a postcard view. So is the one that's sort of an aerial view just above it. And on so this is First Avenue, and then I'm going sort of in a counterclockwise position. You see what the interior, if you were to look all the way down First Avenue from the boardwalk, what they did in Asbury Park is they staggered the buildings, because this is obviously in the days before air conditioning. So they, at the widest point closest to the ocean, to Ocean Avenue and the ocean, the buildings were the furthest apart from the curb. And as you go into the interior or Grand Avenue, the buildings would get increasingly closer and closer and closer to the curb. But the idea was to funnel the ocean air down to help cool the buildings. And then if we took a look at the next slide, I think I'm a little further up. So this is at the other end of the boardwalk, which doesn't have as many amusements on it. And so these were all 4 of these were postcard views, pretty much. And some of them were colorized, some of them were linen postcards, but all 4 of these were, would give you this view, and this 360-degree view of that particular intersection. I received a small amount of validation from a New York Times reporter whom I met by sheer accident, who had bought this book and had used it to find her way around Asbury Park. So I had laid it out. I had used all the postcards I had, plus some additional views, so that you could find your way around this. It's a 1 square mile seaside resort on the Jersey Shore. I went to Rutgers University Press and I pitched them a book based on my travel stories about New Jersey and my postcard collection on New Jersey, which numbered about, was well over 400 at this point. And I wanted to use the chapters based on the 6 tourism regions, and then the 7th chapter, which would be a how-to collect postcards. You all are pretty savvy. I don't, you know what big balloon letters are for postcards, and you know how, or if you, or I can explain more. But this is a Kurt type postcard of New Jersey, and so the destinations in all the letters, the N, the E, the W, are all famous landmarks throughout the entire state, plus the state capital. And the sales team picked through my collection and said yellow and blue sell. And so that's why they settled on this particular postcard to put on the cover of the book for my collection. And if we advance to the next slide, you'll see that in the back, I got to pick one of my favorite postcards about mosquitoes, because what's New Jersey if it doesn't have a nuisance insect to bug you? And so Franz Huld, H-U-L-D, was a postcard publisher in New York City around the turn of the century. And he did a lot of advertising postcards, but he had a series that he did on these hand-drawn mosquitoes, and with some little saying that he would have. Some of the postcards were colorized, some of them were black and white like this with really almost nominal. But I rather like the saying I bought this one. I try to buy them without anything written on them, but sometimes you can't find those in that kind of mint condition. It said we were never troubled by these. And then the rest of the back of the cover has my bio and a few other things. But I rather was going to go off on a whole tangent and start collecting Franz Hold mosquito postcards, but I realized I was getting carried away, so I had to stop myself. I think you all probably have been that way where you found things, it's like a side attraction, and then you want to collect those, and then pretty soon you've got mini collections that are embedded as part of a larger collection that was your original focus. So if we go inside to the next slide, you'll see um, I had I started collecting the advertising postcards of various photographers. And William Broadwell, who Clarissa's from your neck of the woods in Newark, would in the summer months when it's too hot to be in Newark or too hot to be in any cities, he would sort of follow his carriage trade out to the western end of New Jersey and shoot postcards of, he'd shoot views of where people were going to visit. And this is High Point, well before 1928, when eventually the state built a huge obelisk on the top as a tribute to its war veterans. And not in this particular postcard, but sometimes you can see the cord, the photographers have where they will trigger the view so that they're in it. And I've liked this because you don't often find the photographer at work, certainly not in modern day postcards unless it just doesn't happen as much. And so this is an old linen postcard that was in my book. One of my other tangents was William J. Harris, and he was from Wilkes-Barre, Pennsylvania, and he found a ready trade in the resorts that was building up around Lake Hopatcong in northern New Jersey. And what he did is he etched in the emulsion these various captions. And this one was, "We're looking for a man, any old man will do." And he had a lot of real photo postcards, and he had a Jack Russell Terrier that he named Hypo after the chemicals you use to develop film. And I started collecting Harris postcards, real photo postcards, until I met the curator of the Lake Hopatcong Museum, and I realized um, he had a far more extensive postcard collection than I would ever be able to duplicate, and there was really no point in duplicating that. But you often don't find humor in postcards unless you're specifically looking for them. If you're trying to look at all of New Jersey, it becomes an interesting search to find humor that's not sarcastic or degrading in any way. So this was one of the William Harris Real Photo postcards. So this is a chrome. This opens up the chapter on the Jersey Shore. And if you pay close attention to the man in the back with a baseball cap, he's got a little boy standing in front of him on the jetty. He's sort of in the middle of the photo. And I was doing a book signing in Spring Lake at Thanksgiving time. It was the Black Friday at a bookstore in Spring Lake, and this tall, skinny man with a baseball cap and chino pants comes walking in, and he says, "I'm in your book." I had no idea what he was talking about. It turns out that he had done a stint in his lifetime, and he was rather elderly at this point, of contracting with photographers to take pictures that he could turn around and sell to the tourist trade. And he explained to me that he wanted to be in this particular picture, in this particular postcard that with his grandson, that he was going to sell to all the hotel lobbies He wanted it generic enough so that anywhere on 128 miles between Sandy Hook and Cape May, this postcard would work because there's, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers built a slew of jetties out there to try to stop the beach erosion. So I don't know how many of you have had the opportunity to find people in the postcards that you've collected, or even the photographers or the descendants of the photographers. Have any of you had that happen in your collections?
My answer to both is yes.
Oh, fun. Atlantic City had a lot of sand sculptors, and it was a pretty crowded market. So Lorenzo Harris Sr. decided to move up to Asbury Park and create these sand sculptors. And this was my first introduction to the fact that Asbury Park had somebody doing these, and he was selling these postcards of his work to augment the money that people would pitch into his bucket for looking at his sand sculptures. And eventually I managed to find some photographs of his work, which were far more detailed than what this linen postcard would show you. And then met his son, Lorenzo Harris Jr., and therein lies, a whole other family story that has to do with civil rights and that I never expected when I was just collecting postcards of the beach scenes in Asbury Park. He had to get a license from the city to do this, and he had to do this at First Avenue. And this was sometime after World War One, and he kept this up until the Second World War. Coming out of World War One, Ida Jacobs started a little hot dog stand. Eventually, she acquired enough land that she could have a restaurant that she could operate for a little bit longer than her hot dog stand, and then a beer garden. And in 1998, I drove across the country to Illinois, and I went to something called the Lake County Discovery Museum in Wauconda, Illinois. Are any of you familiar with that, or the Kurt Pike postcard collection? Does any of that ring a bell?
Yes.
Okay. So I had made an appointment to visit with them, and they showed me what the photograph had originally been, a black and white photograph with cars on the street scene. And Kurt Tyke had been they had sent Mrs. J. Ida had sent a postcard off to Kurt Tyke, and they erased everything from there so that you would and they had artists on the Kurt Tyke staff that would paint in the windows and try to replicate what the rest of the building looked like if it didn't have any pedestrians and it didn't have any cars. And then she would turn around and then sell these to her customers. And I was thinking about your conversation earlier. So the Kurt Tyke Postcard Archives collection is now moved to something called the Newberry Library in Chicago. Okay. So we don't need to go. If you're familiar with that, then we don't need to go there. But it was a fabulous collection, and it's well over 500,000 cards that they have. And it's a great repository, and so that's my ode to Mrs. J's. It became, if any of you like rock and roll, this is became the Stone Pony, and it was a rock club, and this is where Bruce Springsteen got his start. After I turned this book into Rutgers, I said that I had been researching for 7 years Asbury Park's history, and I wanted a format that did more than just those little brown books did. And I had interviewed a lot of people, so I also wanted more room to tell their stories. And they, as with the postcard book, they had asked me to submit ideas for what the cover could look like. And I wanted a black and white photograph of two guys in black leather jackets looking like something, with their hair greased back from the 1950s. And they said that would not sell. So they asked me to bring in my postcard collection of Asbury Park, and they picked through that. And the designer came up with this idea of having a jacket that had all the colorful postcards that she thought would all work and laid out in this way, with two exceptions. None of these buildings exist anymore on there. So it's become somewhat of a classic. It's also like my Greetings from New Jersey, a postcard tour of the Garden State is out of print. This too is out of print. And it is, people ask me about it rather frequently, and I have to tell them that they have to go to the secondary market and find copies there. But it, to me, I actually love this cover much better than my original choice, because it really speaks to enormous changes that happened to this particular community, and that if it weren't for the photographers that took these pictures and turned them into postcards, we really wouldn't have any kind of visual archive of what Asbury Park once looked like in the early 20th century.
I have a question. Can you talk a little bit about the what it's like, the process and the work that it takes to create a book like the one you did on New Jersey? That one I have here, because it's a pretty thick book with a lot of postcards, and just wonder what that's like.
Well, you have to have an idea, you know, for the book. And because I was still doing travel writing for the Boston Herald at the time, I had it pretty well fixed in my mind that tourism and travel sort of go hand in glove with postcards. And so I had, and it gave me a focus to put all these cards into some kind of an order that would make sense to the general public, as opposed to a scattering of postcards that are idiosyncratic based on my personal taste. It gave it a focus that I wouldn't have had otherwise. And I I didn't pitch that book to anybody else but Rutgers, because I thought that it would do well with them. The unfortunate thing is it's a non-profit press, so once you recoup your original investment in it, you don't tend to make a lot of money. But they, I sequenced the postcards. I chose what should be the establishing picture to open up every chapter, and wrote the narrative, the introduction to the chapters, each chapter, and then as extensive a captions as as the space allowed, because the designer came up with that particular design that you see in Greetings from New Jersey. I didn't have much of a say in that. Writers usually don't,
Have you
unless
ever
they're going to self-publish. I'm
have
sorry.
you ever seen any chromes of these types of postcards? They're exaggerated images, like the fish that's too big or whatever, the
Oh,
jackrabbit,
yeah.
with mosquitoes.
Um, I I had one with a mosquito that sort of alluded to it being some kind of like military helicopter.
Hmm.
Um, and of course, up here, uh, there were pictures of, if you're the large fish, and the fisherman who's in a tiny little boat, and the outsized fish, because of course it's that old saw about the fish was this big that got away kind of thing. And so up here in this area, if I were to go into an antique store looking for postcards, I'm pretty sure I'd still find those. Those are and I'm sure you've seen them. I mean, they're pretty universal in theme.
Always, whenever I always heard about these mosquitoes, that two or three of them could drain you of all your bodily fluids in a matter of minutes,
Yep.
and you'd be a desiccated little hunk of dried up flesh on the ground. And it became a real folklore type thing out in Jersey.
Yes, yes.
Luckily,
They're
we didn't come across the river.
yeah, I didn't I I sort of like the ones that Hull did. So I think there's a certain charm to those as opposed to the exaggerated one. But I don't have those I can't even pull those postcards up because, you know, that's part of what I gave to Rutgers. So sorry.
Yeah, there's a card for a New York City restaurant that features oversized mosquitoes in New Jersey.
Mm, mm.
So I'm not sure if you can see them on the card, but they're next to the train station. So it's the story of people who flee New Jersey for this fancy New York City restaurant called the Carlos Restaurant. So there is a card.
How many cards do you have of the sand sculpture?
Very few. I don't think I hit 5 in total. His became for Lorenzo Harris. They're pretty rare. And I think that had to do with the fact that these were linen postcards, which don't stand up too well over time. I think I had 2 from Atlantic City.
How you manage to get the books published? I mean, it's not that easy. You know, somebody say yes. How you made the first contact? Because it was in your profession that you already knew people, or?
Well, I think what helped was the fact that I was already published as a writer, right?
Mm.
Okay, so I could say, you know, here, you know, I do travel writing for the Boston Herald. I've sold stuff to the New York Times, blah blah blah, and the when Arcadia was just starting out, they had landed. They were a British company, and they landed first in Bath, Maine, I think, and then they worked their way down into the Mid-Atlantic states, and they were getting a toehold in New Jersey. And those of us that were running around together in this small community of collectible postcards and so on were just starting to hear rumblings about Arcadia Publishing, and so we a couple of us, you know, looked them up and and decided to pitch books to Arcadia. And Arcadia was looking for authors. At the time, they were heavily invested in doing outreach to local historical societies, because obviously if they have a collection of postcards, they might want to turn those into books that they could sell to make money. And so it's, you know, it's like it's the small fish that you go and get the slightly bigger fish. So Rutgers University Press became my next stepping stone to have color, because Arcadia was just dealing in black and white. Now Arcadia has competitors that will deal in color, and I don't know. I think one of their competitors was in Pennsylvania, and another competitor was in New York State somewhere. It could have been Long Island. I'm not sure. Queens, maybe even. I think I rolled the dice on the company that was just starting out, as opposed to the more established company that might want more, I don't know, might want more gravitas for me. I have no idea. But that's what I went with where I thought the opportunity was and could turn this around
Thank you.
quickly.
I'm curious about the books that allow that publishers who print with color interiors.
Oh.
And so you said that Rutgers University Press does color interiors. Is it for all your postcards you were able to get them, or how many did they do in color, percentage-wise?
Oh, well, Michael will tell you this, that all of those were in color. That entire volume is in color.
Okay, that's
The
what I was
interior, the
curious
entire
about.
interior
Yeah.
was in color. Versus the second book that was just on Asbury Park, there was a color insert of color photographs and a couple of color postcards, but the chapters themselves they took some of my color postcards and rendered them as black and white.
Right.
Right. So it's how do I say this? It's it's crunching the number. The publisher has to crunch the numbers to decide what kind of book they want and where they want to put the money in terms of, is it going to be so the postcard book was a coffee table book, and it was sort of pitched that way, and it did actually pretty well. The Asbury Park book, despite everything, was still seen as somewhat of and pitched. I didn't pitch it as a hyper-local market because I saw the bigger picture of this is what else was going on in the country at the time. And so I, in my mind, I was looking at Asbury Park as a microcosm of the rest of America. But I don't think Rutgers laid the book out quite that way. And I think that they made a decision to, I think they made a more traditional decision in terms of having that color insert. Does that help? It's purely a estimates that publishers have to make based on the cost that it's going to take to produce the color versus what they think they're going to make on it, right? From the sales of the book. And that book was printed in Singapore. It was printed out of the country.
Great book. I recommend it. It's 250 pages, and there's, like I say, they're in color, and there are a lot of postcards in the book.
I have a question. If it's mostly color, then there's probably mostly more of the printed lithographic postcards as opposed to real photos.
Well, I got to choose because of the way I wanted to tell the story about New Jersey as a travel destination. So, so the real photo postcards, there's several of them that appear in the 7th chapter on how to collect postcards, and there are a couple of them sprinkled throughout the rest of the book, but most of them are color because that's travel. That's what travel and tourism is really all about. So proportionally, I had a whole collection, a binder of real photo postcards, which and even in my New Hampshire and Vermont collection, I have sections in those binders that are real photo postcards that I keep an eye out on, but I'm not actively looking to add to those at the moment.
Because I know in New Jersey, for particularly Atlantic City, I guess Detroit Publishing Company published quite a number of cards, or they're probably some of the most beautiful cards for the Atlantic City resort that I've seen, and I have several myself. I know one of our listeners is the expert on Detroit Publishing Company cards, so she may be able to add to it.
Yeah, so, well, Atlantic City it's like, it's a 7-mile long island. It's a huge it's a huge resort compared to any other part of New Jersey that attracts tourists, right? So they had amazing architecture, and they had the steel pier, and they had amazing entertainment acts, and I loved going to it. Before the casinos took over, it was really lovely to go to Atlantic City. When the wrecking ball came, it was just really painful. And the only way that you could sort of appreciate Atlantic City was to collect the postcards of what it used to look like.
Yeah, Detroit did some very good shots of the boardwalk and the people on the boardwalk. Very, very good for looking at the fashions and styles of resort wear at the time that they were done. I'm quite impressed with them. Then they did some nice shots where they did it at night with all the bright lights. It's
well, Thomas Edison, Atlantic City was a bonanza for Thomas Edison, the light bulb, right? Because he struck all those billboards where he could plug lights in and get people's attention was a huge bonanza for him. And also for his poured concrete. It was just, for Thomas Edison and Atlantic City were like a match made in entrepreneurial heaven.
We have a concrete expert here tonight too.
Oh.
Well, actually, I'm still looking. Edison promoted some concrete houses that were multiple. I could not find a postcard about them. And if you do, I will be more than elated to have it, or at least seeing it.
Ugh, yeah, I can't answer that question. But I know about those concrete houses, and the first blush of knowing about them comes from postcards. So, but I can't sum it up out of my.
I found it from a book because he was
Yeah.
promoting postcard concrete housing for being cheap, because he was preparing molds that were the
Yeah.
same one, and then you pour the house, demold, and use the same metal mold to build the next house. It
Right.
didn't work out economically, but I know there are some houses, what I read, there are some houses that were built,
Yeah.
but I can't find a postcard about them.
Keep looking.
Yeah, of
Keep
course,
looking. Yeah.
I was wondering.
Yeah. Well, speaking of real photo postcards, so in
We have an expert
So
on
in
that
the-
here too.
I'm sorry?
There's an expert on this call on real photo postcards as well.
Jeremy.
Oh,
Yeah.
well, my favorite one is one of my favorite ones is of Thomas Edison and Henry Ford, because they used to travel together.
Mhm.
And so that's one of the rare real photo postcards that's stuck in the book, not in the 7th chapter. Because a lot of people at the time, I realize I'm speaking to a far more knowledgeable audience than I typically do, but a lot of people didn't know that the two men were friends, and in fact,
Mhm.
Henry Ford bought his Menlo Park laboratory and moved it all to Dearborn, Michigan, as part of his museum compound.
And Mr. Firestone and Calvin Coolidge, and sure.
Yeah.
George Eastman too, I think. George Eastman was friends with them, I think.
Well, the
Wouldn't surprise me.
Henry Ford's Greenfield Village is really very, very nice. It's well worth going out to visit if you make your way into the Detroit area. And
Well, okay.
so I
Okay.
highly recommend it. I live on the other side of Michigan, but it is very good. I mean, the whole collection of stuff he's got there. Henry Ford's his own stuff besides bringing the Menlo Park and other historic structures, and it's really well done. And it was nice that he preserved Menlo Park. Even I know it was originally New Jersey.
Right. Well, we have his factory in East Orange. Well, I don't live in New Jersey anymore, but yeah. And the Black Maria, where he did film, the very first motion picture films. Clarissa, you asked about where his house was. It was in Llewellyn Park.
Yeah,
Is
no.
that what you?
Oh,
No, what I posted here is where the Edison concrete houses were built.
Oh, okay.
Those are
Sorry, I didn't understand
the
that.
first one were by Edison, under Edison. The other one were by somebody else who took because it didn't work for Edison. And they built these houses, and so I didn't know, maybe you knew about them or a strong postcard about them.
No, I think you've tapped me out on what I know about concrete.
I just curious. I just asked.
Gotta ask. I'm with you.
So if you come across anything, let me know.
Okay, I will.
A quick note for Clarissa, if she's interested. Albert MacArthur and Frank Lloyd Wright did the Arizona Biltmore in Phoenix area. And it was all done with cast concrete block. Frank Lloyd Wright designed it and did the sort of production, but the design of the building and the architecture was done by MacArthur. But it's still in place now, but it's a very elaborate cast concrete resort hotel with a really wonderful design. Whole series of really good real photo postcards about that and advertising cards. So it might be something for you to look at if you're interested in concrete construction. It was done in the late 20s.
Okay, thank you.
Sure.
Okay, there's no other questions. And Helen, I want to thank you very much for your
Thank you very
presentation.
much. Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Thank
It
you.
was a
Good.
pleasure.
Thank you.
Hey,
And
you
do
kept me
check
on
in
my
the book.
toes. Thank you so much.